Alright folks, welcome back. Glad to have you. Mark here. No, this channel hasn't changed direction, and yes, Mage War 2nd Edition is still in development. Right now I'm just having a real tough time getting everything playtested, but Mage War is forever, and nothing can ever stop it. So anyway, to the video. In my time away, I've been staying extremely busy, as always, working on whatever I can. I'm starting this new video series here because, although my passion in life is not writing, not surprisingly, other forms of entertainment intersect with game design, and strangely enough, I seem to have stumbled on another amazing eureka moment. It appears I may have accidentally discovered the grand unified theory of storytelling. I wish this was a joke video, but it's not, so this is either going to be cringe gold or it's going to blow your mind. Either way, I hope it's a good show. So, in this series, I'm going to destroy all the stories everyone thinks are the best, or at least seminal, and demonstrate that none of them are even complete stories. I will fix these stories in these videos, and you will see the grand unified theory of storytelling at work. This is just an example of a fix, though. You could fix a story any number of infinite ways, just so long as you adhere to the grand unified theory of storytelling. Also to note, while a complete story is guaranteed to entertain a wide audience, even a complete story could be improved by a more skilled writer, whether by improving its prose, its narratives, or both. First though, we're going to read this short excerpt that describes how Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein to demonstrate this novel realization that no writer, living or dead, can tell you what a story is. Except me, of course, who isn't a writer. That's all of them, that all of them, whether good or bad, yeah, it is all of them, whether good or bad, whether for books, movies, TV, comics, you name it, all of these authors are doing this completely on instinct with no actual idea of how to write a complete story. This is why none of them can tell you what a story is, and it's the reason why we get flat endings, boring characters, flashy characters we don't care about, scenes that don't do anything in the story despite somehow moving the plot forward, and so many other problems. I'm not a good writer. I'm not a writer at all. I just know how to write a story. So we're going to read this part here from the composition section on the Frankenstein's Wikipedia. During the summer of 1816, the year without a summer, the world was locked in a long volcanic winter caused by the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815. Mary Shelley, aged 18, and her lover and future husband, Percy Shelley, visited Lord Byron at the Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The weather was too cold and dreary that summer to enjoy the outdoor holiday activities they had planned, so the group retired indoors until dawn. Sitting around a log fire at Byron's Villa, God, I'm getting a lot of typos here in my brain, the company amused themselves by reading German ghost stories translated into French from the book Phantasmagoriana. Surprised I pronounced that correctly. Byron proposed that they each write a ghost story. Unable to think of a story, not surprisingly, Mary Shelley became anxious, because she didn't know how. She recalled being asked, "Have you thought of a story?" each morning, and every time being forced to reply with a mortifying negative. During one evening in the middle of the summer, the discussions turned to the nature of the principle of life. Perhaps a corpse could be reanimated, Mary noted. Galvanism had given token of such things. It was after midnight before they retired, and unable to sleep, she became possessed by her imagination as she beheld the grim terrors of her waking dream. I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be, for supremely frightful would be the effect of any human endeavor to mock the stupendous mechanism of the creator of the world. Well, those are some very good prose, Mary Shelley, but the story sucks, so we're going to fix it. So Frankenstein is told in epistolary form, correspondences between characters. These are letters being written back and forth, and these characters also are also the framing device for the story. So it starts with them talking about Frankenstein, and then it's the guy Walton, how he was in the Arctic on a ship, and they rescued Frankenstein, and Frankenstein sees in Walton his own hubris, so he decides to tell him the story of why he's in the Arctic hunting this monster he created to warn Walton. This is basically Act 1 here. In the original story, Victor creates the monster while consumed in reckless work, out of grief from his mother dying. This is strong motivation to be sad, to be sure, but it leans too heavily on the sadness to justify the monster, despite Victor's entire reason justify making the monster, sorry. Despite Victor's entire reason for telling the story being a warning against hubris, it is not hubris that makes the monster. Mary Shelley only shows that sadness is what caused Victor to pursue this unnatural work. I guess we could infer hubris, but she could have illustrated that more directly. I'll try to preserve as much of the original narrative as possible, and I think that means keeping this part, but since it undermines our narrative, we need a fix. Also, the framing device doesn't make sense because it doesn't give us any exposition or introduce any characters that will tie in later to the plot. The framing device character, Walton, appears again at the end of the original text, but he doesn't do anything that matters. For my version of the story, these framing device characters don't appear at all. Actually, let me read you that little ending summary here on the Wikipedia. It's good, and it gives you that ending scene of Walton. This is the end framing device. So the beginning is them talking, or Walton talking, I think, to his sister in a letter about how he met Frankenstein. The end is what happened when he died. So at the end of Victor's narrative, Captain Walton resumes telling the story. A few days after the creature vanishes, the ship becomes trapped in pack ice, and several crewmen die in the cold before the rest of Walton's crew insists on returning south once it's freed. Upon hearing the crew's demands, Victor is angered and, despite his condition, gives a powerful speech to them. He reminds them of why they chose to join the expedition and that it is hardship and danger, not comfort, that defines a glorious undertaking such as theirs. He urges them to be men, not cowards. However, although the speech makes an impression on the crew, it is not enough to change their minds, and when the ship is freed, Walton regretfully decides to return south. Victor, even though he is in a very weak condition, states that he will go on by himself. He is adamant that the creature must die. Victor dies shortly thereafter, telling Walton in his last words to seek happiness in tranquility and avoid ambition. Walton discovers the creature on his ship, mourning over Victor's body. The creature tells Walton that Victor's death has not brought him any peace. Rather, his crimes have made him even more miserable than Victor ever was. The creature vows to kill himself so that no one will ever know of his existence, and Walton watches as the creature drifts away on the ice raft, never to be seen again. Well, we're going to talk about that ending a little bit. But, I don't think this story needs a framing device, really, but you could include one to maintain the spirit of the original. Regardless, Victor's childhood largely remains the same, except instead of just being interested in alchemy, he's both gifted and precocious, and not yet arrogant. Victor's motivation needs to be explicitly, from the young age onward, that he wants to improve the world with science. But after his mother's death, he becomes a flawed hero whose motivations get corrupted by his grief. This complicates the story in a way that adds drama and horror without undermining the morality or goals of the hero. Because here, he still has a chance to redeem himself. He feels guilty for being a scientist, but not being able to save his mother, who dies of scarlet fever just before he gets into college. So he believes his ends justify the means in abusing science to try to bring her back. That's how I would write it. He's originally trying to bring his mother back. Soon he learns how to reanimate flesh, but in this first successful test, he instead creates the monster. So now the story can continue as written after Victor gets frightened and abandons the monster, because now he has his heroic motivation to improve the world with science. Although it's corrupted right now, he's learned both the harshness of the world through his mother's death and also the wonder of its possibilities through his success in science. And now we hit Act 2. So Act 2 of Mary Shelley's original text Act 2 of Mary Shelley's original text starts with Victor learning about his brother William's death, knowing it was the creature. To make the monster an even worse villain, his adopted sister Justine, who was William's nanny, is framed for William's murder, again by the monster. I think she's put to death. Victor then retreats to the mountains out of guilt and encounters the monster. Instead of killing him, the monster tells his story and makes his demands for Victor to make him a bride or he'll kill the rest of his family. Victor agrees, but here's where we have to divert again from Mary Shelley. So the rest of the original narrative sees Victor marry Elizabeth, who is another adopted sister of his, and actually there's different versions of her, but this is seemingly out of nowhere with no justification. He, and likely Elizabeth as well, definitely would not be in a state to get or stay married at this point in the story after having just lost William and Justine. It just doesn't make sense. Mary Shelley, though, writes that they get married, and then the creature kills her that night. Victor pursues it all the way to the Arctic Ocean, where Victor dies, and then the monster commits suicide out of its own grief. This seems like a cop-out ending to me. To fix it, let's go back. So Elizabeth has nothing to do with the plot. In the fixed version of the story, she doesn't need to be there at all, although perhaps you could fit her in somewhere. Although she wouldn't have much to do, she could appear in his childhood, and they could fall in love at some point, but then his grief overtakes him, and he drowns himself in his work, effectively breaking up with her. She waits and hopes that one day he'll get over his grief, and then at the end of the story, that can happen, and they can get married. I just don't think it adds much except sprinkles on the sundae. Nevertheless, I'll show a version of this fix where Elizabeth is kept in as a character when we get to Act 3. So, Victor agrees to creating the Bride of Frankenstein after hearing the monster's story. Victor begins to realize his responsibility to help him and fix the harm he's done, and that he's just as mad at himself for the deaths of William and Justine as he is the monster. That diverts heavily from Mary Shelley, where he does agree, but it's more just kind of because he's being threatened, or his family's being threatened. So while making the bride, Victor thinks about his mother, and he realizes that treating this new creation with compassion could have the opposite effect he had on the monster, and that this might also solve the monster's woes and change his nature. The bride is a success, and Victor gives her his mother's name. As with the original narrative, the monster becomes suspicious of Victor while he's making the bride, but in the fixed story, this culminates right as Victor names the bride after his mother, instead of destroying her, as happens in the original narrative. And the monster sees this. It breaks into the lab and accuses Victor of inciting the bride to betray him once Victor gives her over. The monster says he's going to kill Elizabeth and goes to do just that. Victor and the bride then follow the monster and get to the house just in time with the monster's hand around Elizabeth's throat. The monster meets the bride now for the first time, and this is where she speaks to him and warms his heart and stops his rampage. Upon giving the bride away to be married to the monster, Victor finally accepts his mother's death. The compassion he showed the bride gave her the compassion to love the monster, and Victor and Elizabeth also then have a moment and later can get married. Elizabeth's original part in the story as written could be preserved with this ending where, as written again, before she writes letters to Victor during the story to help him deal with his grief. But now those story beats are happening in the right places, and they play out in a way that doesn't undermine the story's structure. It actually makes sense at the end here. Victor also apologizes to the monster, and the monster accepts and asks to make amends for his crimes. Victor asks the monster if he'd like to get to be his research partner and further his work, and the monster agrees. This version of the story ends with Victor publishing his work, which proves that while death cannot be reversed, the bonds of life are so strong that they can be made even unnaturally. This creates multiple new fields of study, and maybe Victor could name the biological mechanism he's discovered after William and Justine. So I think my version of this story actually gets the point across about hubris rather than just saying it. I think my story is also simultaneously more horrifying and more fulfilling. I get to the end and I feel that not only has the story concluded, but that it's still alive and continues after it ends. It's a complete story. But how do we improve a complete story? Really, the thing that stands out here is the monster. Technically, we could ignore that and stop here with our fixed story and it's complete, but what could be improved is the story lacks, or it's not living up to the potential of its own gravitas, i.e. how dramatic it could be. Mary Shelley goes through the trouble of making the monster highly intelligent, but we never see any real demonstration of that. The monster we get the most we get is the monster being clever and being able to commit murder, frame others for those murders, although not always successfully, and then evade capture. If you make a monster and then tell your reader it's super intelligent, you really need to play that out through the plot. The way the story is written, the monster's intelligence is never a significant plot detail, and the story would be the same if Mary had just written that the monster had the intelligence of a man with animal cunning. The proper way to do this would be to have some aspect of Frankenstein's experiment go wrong, thus creating the monster because Victor was too arrogant to be more thorough in his research and just barreled forward, and then the monster figures out his own scientific breakthrough after Frankenstein abandons him. But the monster needs Frankenstein's half of the research to complete his, which he plans to learn by spying on Frankenstein while he makes his bride. And that's Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, both fixed and punched up. But let's do the autopsy of the original text. Well, aside from the narrative tweaks I've talked about, cutting a few characters and cutting out the unnecessary framing device, the real central problem with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is that it lacks a hero. Victor Frankenstein is set up to be the hero as the main character, but he never lives up to it. His motivation isn't heroic, and in fact, she misses at least 2 opportunities to give him that motivation with justification in the story, and he also doesn't ever act heroically. He neither defeats nor redeems the villain, and even his act of telling the story to Walton to warn him about his hubris is undermined by the narrative that he's telling, which goes out of its way to make grief and guilt the forces that drive him, not hubris. Those are certainly emotions that can affect a character, but there's no substance to emotions alone as motivations here. In a complete Frankenstein story, those negative emotions would affect the hero's motivation, not be his motivation. Also, one last thing I forgot to mention, at the end of the story, where Victor presents their research, we find out that the combined discoveries of both Frankenstein and the monster resulted in whatever the stable form of the artificial flesh Victor was originally trying to create. Or maybe it leaves off on some cliffhanger where there's some additional component of the research, and it kind of leaves it open or something. But anyway, yeah, that's it. I will get to another story soon, and we'll see what's next. See ya.